Hello everyone, and welcome to the Privacy, the New Software Development Dilemma webinar. We're going to give everybody about one more minute or so to log in, and we will get started. Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Privacy, the New Software Development Dilemma. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's session. Our session will be enhanced by your participation, so please submit your questions via the Ask a Question button throughout the presentation. We will answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of today's session. If you experience any audio issues during the session, please click on the Rate This button on the top of your player window and follow the instructions to receive help. Just a reminder that this event will be available on demand just a few minutes after the session concludes. Everyone in attendance will receive an email with a link to the recording, a copy of the presentation, and some additional resources. In the meantime, we invite you to follow our channel for access to upcoming events and on-demand content. Now let's get started by introducing today's presenter, Kevin Poniatowski. Kevin is a principal security engineer here at Security Innovation. He brings an optimal blend of speaking ability, technical savvy, and an insatiable passion for security to Security Innovation's training customers. Since joining Security Innovation in 2007, he has split his time between application security course development, delivering instructor-led courses, and driving our customer success program. And with that, Kevin, it's off to you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. And as Rebecca mentioned, I'm Kevin Poniatowski, and I've now been teaching application security and data privacy courses for almost 12 years. And a lot of the issues surrounding implementing data privacy throughout an organization is about building best practices and policies. But today we're going to focus on, well, how do we help the development team? What are they supposed to do? What can they do when they're building their applications to help protect this data and reduce the chance of having any kind of privacy violation? And speaking of privacy violations, there was a big news in data privacy yesterday, if you haven't seen it. This is an article from the Wired magazine website from yesterday, and it starts with when the lip-syncing app musical.ly, maybe it's also known as Musical.ly, first exploded in popularity near 4 years ago. It was best known for being a teen sensation, but according to the United States Federal Trade Commission, the app also illegally collected information from children under the age of 13. The agency announced Wednesday the application, now known as TikTok, has agreed to pay a $5.7 million fine to settle the allegations, which the agency described as the largest civil penalty ever obtained by the Federal Trade Commission in a children's privacy case. The application TikTok must also comply with the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act going forward and take down any videos uploaded by users under the age of 13. So there is a lot of legislation out there today, and depending on the countries that our applications are going to be downloaded to and used by users, this is a lot for development teams to understand. So today we're going to talk about how do we help them out and what can those teams do to try to avoid these horrible things happening to their organization. So we're going to talk about, well, how do we design privacy into the software? And first, we need to have an important conversation about how do we implement privacy throughout the life cycle at the application. And this is something we can do during the design phase, during a sprint for the development team. And we need to think about, well, what do we do with the data throughout the user's interaction with the application? And that's something that's very easy to do, but we can't just stop there. We also have to think about, okay, now the user has turned off their account or disabled their account. Now what do we do with their data? And we even have to go a step further and think about, okay, what do we do with this data once we've decided that we're going to end of life this application? How do we handle the data then? So there's a lot to think about here. And I remember as I was a developer for over 10 years, well, we were really good at thinking about how data flowed through the application while it was actually being used, but we didn't think about, well, what do we do with the data once the user is no longer using our application, and what do we do with the data when our application is end of life? So this is something we need to design before we actually start writing any code and actually build a plan for how are we going to handle these situations. So we want to make sure that our development team has an understanding about what are the data privacy best practices that our organization has created policies for and created best practices for, so our development team doesn't make any bad assumptions about what should be done with this data and how this data should be handled. For example, it says here, don't require unnecessary application permissions. This is something that is very common and is an application security issue and a data privacy issue, because we may be making a malicious user's job easier if we're setting permissions too high within an application. And just as an example, and I think I used this in the previous webinar, where about a year ago we had the Panera Bread data breach. And how it started was when a user logged into their Panera Bread account, their account ID number was shown in the URL address bar. And a security researcher noticed this after logging into their Panera Bread account and just added 1 to the account number right there in the URL address bar and was able to see someone else's information. These permissions were not set correctly. Well, often applications, not only will they not set the permissions correctly, they'll also ask for unnecessary application permissions. Maybe giving them the ability to collect unnecessary data. For example, an application, a flashlight application for a mobile phone is asking for permission to collect geolocation data. Why would a flashlight app need geolocation data? So we need to make sure during design time that our application is only asking for the permissions it absolutely needs, and it's only going to collect the data that that application absolutely needs. We're lowering the chances that we're collecting data that laws are going to be very strict on how we handle. So also, we want to make sure that our development team has access to our data definition policies so that they understand which pieces of data that they're going to be collecting has to be treated as sensitive data. And so I have a list here of some examples of user and personal data that can be considered very sensitive. And some of this may be completely obvious, whether it's political opinions or health data, genetic data, but something here, I have here trade union membership. I can guarantee as a developer that never would have even occurred to me could be considered sensitive data, whether a person was a member of a trade union or not, but it is. So we want to make sure that our development teams not only have access to any data definition documentation that we have, but we also need to make sure they are going to be using it very actively so they understand that we have these pieces of data that we're collecting that must be protected well. The last one here, past or spent criminal convictions. Certainly very sensitive, and there are laws built around, when this data, how this data has to be protected. So we want to make sure developers are not making any assumptions. So we have to make sure they have access to our data definitions and that they are actively using it. And this documentation is the kind of documentation that is going to be very active. This is something that can change anytime the laws change. So we want to make sure this isn't just something that we create and then kind of fades out of everyone's memory, but it's something that's actively being used to protect the organization. Also, getting back to limited data collection and retention, it's real easy for developers to say, well, I know we're going to have access to all this information from a user's browser, so we're just going to, grab all of it because we might use it later. I remember having that same thought process, and we can't think like that anymore because of all the legislation. So we have to catch ourselves and make sure development teams are really thinking about, do we need this data? What are we specifically going to use this data for? Because if we don't need it and we still collect it, we still have a responsibility for following the laws that, talk about how we protect this data. So it's going to be a lot easier. If we don't need it, we don't collect it. Now, but also it might be easy for someone without an understanding of how complex the rules are around how we handle this sensitive data to just say things like, well, we're going to keep it in case we need it later. And I can, maybe, it'd be simple for a business analyst to say that, but for a development team, we want to keep this as simple as possible for them. So we do not want to keep it. If we're going to need it later, well, let's make sure we have a use case and this is all defined. We do all the work we need to do around this because of these data privacy laws, but we want to make sure we're just not doing it without actually understanding if we need that data or not. And then finally, we have to think about what is the minimum amount of time we're going to need this data for. Maybe we don't need to keep it any longer than 2 weeks, 1 month, 6 weeks. We don't want to let ourselves fall into the trap of, well, we're just going to write it into this database and then forget about it. Because what can happen is maybe down the road, a few months later, the development team needs some good test data. And they say, oh, well, we'll just grab the data out of this database, not recognizing, oh, there's sensitive data in there. If we move that over into our testing environment, we could be breaking the law. Or maybe we're moving this data up into a cloud environment, and now we've made a backup copy of a database, and we've forgotten about it. So when a user asks us to delete all their data, we don't recognize that we have copies of that data, and we don't know where it is. So we really have to think about how do we limit data collection and retention just to make our jobs easier as members of a development team, so we just don't fall into any of the pitfalls and just accidentally break a law that maybe the development team isn't aware of. So one of the ways a development team can really help to mitigate the chances of having any kind of data privacy violations is implementing what we call the principle of least privilege. And this is a principle I've been talking about for years, specifically for application security, but it also is going to be a very important part of our data protection, because what the principle of least privilege states is that we should be setting the permissions so that a user can only gain access to data that they absolutely need to get their job done and nothing more. They only get permissions to do exactly what they need to do and nothing more. And the same thing for any other administrative users of the application. They only get the permissions to do exactly what they need to do to get their job done. So we're granting users a minimal set of system and object privileges to accomplish the tasks they need to get done. Now, I was a developer back in the long, long ago days of Windows 98, where when everyone logged in, they logged in as admin. And every application that was being built for Windows 98 was running with admin permissions because it made everything very easy to do. That's true. But it also, giving all that permission away, made malicious users and malicious hackers' jobs a lot more easier. And we don't want to do that anymore. We want to make sure we're protecting this data as well as we can. So we're going to implement this principle of least privilege and really lock down those permissions. You don't get that permission unless you absolutely need it. And taking it a step further, once you are done needing those permissions, we will revoke them as they're no longer required. Now, this then goes into permission management, which is not simple. It can be complicated. You know, we might have to purchase a tool to help us with permission management, and I know there are tools out there. But I remember when I left my last full-time developer job, you know, I'm going through my exit interview, and I thought, well, you know, I have to leave the office in a couple hours from now, but I want to send out a nice goodbye email to everyone. And I sat down at my desk, and I no longer had permission to email anyone. It had already been revoked. I didn't need it anymore. So we want to make sure we're revoking permissions as needed. So if a user deletes their account, we want to make sure any permissions they previously had are revoked and they can no longer access any data. So we just want to be careful and understand that, you know, as a developer, I want to get my job done as quickly as possible, and that might mean just making one higher level permission setting because it just makes it, you know, my life a whole lot easier and convenient. And that is true, it does. But it also makes the malicious hackers' jobs easier and convenient. So we want to make sure we're not pressuring our development team into getting the applications done as soon as possible without implementing this principle of least privilege, because this is such an important layer of defense when it comes to protecting access to sensitive data. So we want to make sure, you know, we're just not kind of caught up in getting this job done quickly when, you know, we know there are laws out there that are going to legislate how the data we are collecting is going to be handled. You know, we don't want to make sure that, like an application like TikTok, you know, if we are collecting sensitive data like data that is defined under the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, that we are doing it correctly and we are following the laws. So this principle of least privilege is probably one of the most important principles that developers can follow when creating an application. And this goes way past data privacy. This is something that if we're implementing correctly, malicious hackers will really struggle with, because every hacker wants to become an administrator, every hacker wants to become root, and this makes that job very, very difficult. Even if they find, malicious hackers find a vulnerability that gives them a little bit of an opening into an application, if this principle of least privilege is set up correctly, maybe they can't get access to any sensitive data. They just, that account that they have gained access to does not have the permission. So this really is going to make their job very, very difficult. And that's the best we can do when it comes to protecting our data and stopping malicious hackers. We'll never be 100% successful. We're building applications with millions of lines of code. There's a lot of complexity there. The best we can do is make it very, very difficult for attackers. And by implementing this principle of least privilege, that is exactly what we're doing. So we want to make sure that this is designed directly into our applications before any code is written. So we have to think about assigning privileges to users, assigning privileges to the code, and assigning privileges to the data that we are collecting with the least privilege possible. Allowing our users to get the job done, but they can't do anything else. So that's going to take some thought. So this has to be done at design time. So, depending on the operating system and the programming languages that the development team is using, this is definitely going to take some effort, but it's so important, and it is a very important line of defense that protects our organization, protects the data we're collecting, and protects our users from data breaches. So that just kind of leads into, I want to go into the OWASP Top 10 privacy risks now, because there's a lot of good information and understanding, well, what are those most common privacy risks, and then how do we help our development teams to mitigate these risks kind of rearing their heads and something bad happens and we have a data privacy violation. So the first one is, well, often web application vulnerabilities, these are security vulnerabilities, can lead to data privacy violations. So this does not happen 100% of the time, but it is number one on our list, that often the web application vulnerability leads to data privacy violation. So we have to take this into account, and so we have to make sure that our web application developers for web applications and are trained so that they are writing secure code, they are designing secure applications, and as a side effect of that, they will often be mitigating the risk of having any kind of data privacy violations. Now, we also want to make sure that they are trained to understand, about data privacy, so the two together are very complementary. Other things we can do is making sure that our development team is having secure code reviews and that they're following secure coding guidelines as, designed by perhaps, project management or senior developers who understand, how to write code securely, and then making sure it's reviewed so that other developers are following those best practices. And then other rules such as, installing updates and patches on a regular basis and performing regular penetration tests that actually focus on data privacy are going to hopefully find any kind of web application vulnerabilities before they reach a production environment. So security and data privacy are complementary. They do overlap, but not perfectly. So we can't just rely on application security to help us when it comes to data privacy. We also have to educate our development team in data privacy. Next on our list is operator-sided data leakage. So this is data that we have already collected through our application, but then somehow we have leaked it. Whether it is we have sent it to a third party that we have a relationship with without recognizing that that was illegal, or maybe it was an unintentional mistake. Maybe we have stored this data up into a public cloud environment. We thought it was a private cloud environment, but there was a misconfiguration of some kind, and it was a public environment. So this is also very common. And just recently I've been teaching some secure cloud development courses, and this is a big concern. And so we have to recognize that when it comes to data privacy, we're going to be either sharing this sensitive data or storing it outside of the organization, we need to use this principle of least privilege. And maybe this principle of least privilege says, all right, these certain pieces of data that we know are sensitive because a law tells us we're not allowed to share them. So that permission is set to, they don't get any. It's not, oh, they only have read permission. No, they don't have any permissions. We want to make sure the development team understands that so they don't make any bad assumptions. Also, a tool like using strong encryption. If we're storing sensitive data up in a cloud environment, maybe we make sure that that data is encrypted before we send it up to the cloud. That way, even if there is any kind of a misconfiguration, well, the data is encrypted. So it is still protected, it is still private, and we haven't created any kind of a violation. The final one here on this slide, anonymization of personal data. Maybe accidentally a developer who was unaware of the rules has copied actual production data into a testing environment and didn't recognize that there was sensitive data there, and we now have a data privacy violation. Maybe we could anonymize personal data so that we could use it in a testing environment, so that any sensitive data is now protected, whether it's by using some kind of masking technique or another anonymization technique, so that when it gets to a testing environment, we can't actually take that anonymized data and be able to figure out, all right, who is this data actually connected to? So we want to make sure we do that so we're not having any kind of a data leakage issue. Next on our list is insufficient data breach response. So this is something that we've seen periodically over my years in application security, where an organization is alerted either by a government organization like the FBI or a security researcher, or even it could be a student at a university, and they say, hey, I found a security vulnerability in your application that could lead to a data breach, and the organization does not take this seriously and they don't fix it. We just had this happen, oh shoot, the story came out probably 3 weeks ago, and what happened was a member of that organization was contacted by a security researcher, and that the member of the organization, who I think may have been like the CTO, said, yes, we will absolutely take care of this. And then they didn't do anything for 6 months. And the security researchers saw that they were going to be at a security conference and thought, oh, well, I'll go talk to them at the security conference to make sure that we didn't have a miscommunication. And the story is that the CTO, when they learned who the security researcher was, may have physically assaulted that security researcher, which is terrible. Not the way we want to handle any kind of a data breach. We actually want to have a plan in place. Want to make sure that we alert our users that there may have possibly been a data breach or a data leak. Now, this could be even if we don't have any evidence of someone outside the organization accessing this data, but the potential was there. And there are certain laws, depending on where our users are located, that say we have to let people know this may have happened. So when it comes to helping us lower the risk of something like this, we want to make sure we have an incident response plan. We don't want to wait until something bad happens before we start to think about, well, what do we do now? We actually want to have a plan in place so that when it does happen, we know what to do. We follow the plan. And then when we create a plan, we can also test it. We can use a tabletop exercise to say, okay, let's say a member of our call center was contacted by a user, and the user said, I found this, and it looks like a security vulnerability. What does that member of the call center do? And as an exercise, we kind of walk through the process to see how well does our incident response plan handle these situations, to look for possible problems in the plan. Maybe we need to be a little more thorough or a little more detailed in the plan. So we want to make sure we have a plan in place so that when something bad happens, we have a plan, we follow it, and then that's often something that we can do to lower the chances of making a bad situation even worse. So that was before having a data breach. Now, when we do have a data breach, what do we do then? Well, we follow our plan, but we also have to make sure, is it a real issue? Or is this just someone that they either had a misunderstanding of how the application worked, or they just have no idea what they're talking about and it's fake, it's not real. We have to validate the incident. So that means we have to have someone on the development team of the application have the ability to test this out to make sure, do we have a problem here or not? And then if that the member of the development team does agree this is actually an issue, it could even be a member of a security team, then we have to assign this to this incident to a manager who's responsible for the investigation. And this should all be part of that plan. So we know exactly what to do. We follow the steps of the plan, and then if something bad does happen, we follow that plan. We get an investigation started within our own organization. Our developers, someone is responsible for figuring out if this is a real problem. And if it is, we notify the data owner so that we are in compliance with data privacy laws. Next, depending on the type of privacy laws we fall under, one of the risks is insufficient deletion of personal data. So we are not complying with the law that says we have to delete this personal data if they terminated their account or after they have requested it. So the GDPR is very famous for having that right to be forgotten. And that may mean that, if a user requests us to delete all their data that we have been storing, we have to do it. So we want to make sure that we have our development teams understand that personal data should be deleted after, let's say, termination of their account or termination of a specific purpose or time frame, depending on what the law specifies. Now, this is where we have to get someone who understands those laws to document this so our development team doesn't have to come to their own conclusions about it. We also have to make sure that we have data retention, archival, and deletion policies already documented to our development team so they can implement that into their design and into their implementation when they're writing their code. So again, they don't have to make decisions about, well, how do we think this might work? It's already defined to them. So they're just implementing a requirement, a use case that has already been given to them because they're not subject matter experts when it comes to data privacy, most likely. And we always have to be very careful about what about the data that we have stored in backups or we have copied to other locations or that we have shared with third parties. Maybe sharing with a third party is absolutely legal. However, to still be compliant, this user says, I want you to delete all my data, and that means we have to then talk to this third party and say, they also have to delete that data. So this can get pretty complicated. So we want to make sure we're documenting it before the development team starts to get to their design time, and they don't have to make bad guesses about what's happening or what should happen. Number 5 is, now this doesn't fall on the developers' responsibilities, non-transparent terms, policies, and conditions. So this is when an application where we know that we're going to be requesting sensitive data of our users. However, we're not providing sufficient information to the users to describe how data is processed, how it's collected, how it's going to be stored, and how it's going to be deleted. And even if we are doing that, we need to make sure that it's described in an easily accessible and understandable way for users who are not lawyers. Because like me, if it's written in a way only attorneys are going to understand, well, that could mean we're not compliant with these data privacy laws. So this is something that has to occur outside of the development team. Maybe we have a privacy team or members of our security team that can actually be involved in writing this and making it so that we are explaining to our users what is happening with their data, why we need it, and that it's written in a way that non-lawyers understand. And that may not be, as simple as I make it sound, and I hope I'm not making it sound simple. But we want to make sure our users understand that. So if something bad does happen, we're protecting the organization from users saying, well, I didn't know this was happening. It's like, well, this was, shown to you, and you actually agreed that you understood it, and that we have made sure that it is easily understandable, so we really reduce the chances of anyone having a misunderstanding. Number 6 here, collection of data not required for the primary purpose. And this is something that we see a lot of applications struggling with, that they're collecting descriptive, demographic, or any other user-related data that we actually don't need for the purposes of this application. This is one of those situations where maybe a developer or project manager said, well, maybe we'll need this data later. And we also maybe aren't actually, the user isn't providing consent for us to collect this data because it doesn't fall under the data we're telling them that we're collecting that we need specifically for this application. So we want to make sure that when we are creating a business reason for the creation of an application and the reasoning behind data collection, that we have a purpose for the collection of that personal data of our users and of our customers. And we want to make sure that development team only collects the data required to fulfill that purpose. And they aren't collecting data just to make it easy for them, later down the road, later in the future. Our default should be we're going to collect as little data as possible unless the user chooses otherwise, and we're only going to collect the data we absolutely need to get the job done. So that's going to take some conversations, and we want to make sure that by having that conversation that everyone is going to follow the same best practices on the development team, and they know exactly what data they need, and that's all they're going to be collecting. Next one here, sharing of data with third parties. This is something that's very common, and if you enjoy browsing the internet, this is something you have to be concerned with because a lot of sites are sharing data with third parties. There's a lot of really good reasons why this happens. We just have to make sure that if we're collecting data that is considered sensitive by any laws, that we are alerting our users that we are sharing data with third parties, and that we're doing, if we are sharing it, that we're doing it in a legal fashion. So this is something, again, our development team, they're not subject matter experts in this area. We want to make sure that they are very well educated on what data is allowed to be shared with third parties, what data is not. And so if they have to run of any kind of a service that shares data with a third party, if we have sensitive data that is not allowed to be sent, the development team is very clear on that information, and they're making sure that that data is not leaving our organization. And as an example of a lot of data that is, the type of data that is shared to third parties, it could be location data of our users. It could be analytics data. So it could be, what type of browser are they using? What type of operating system are they using? What is the age of the user? What is the race of the user? All of a sudden, we just steered into sensitive data, and so we don't want to rely on the developers to catch that. We want to define it to them so they understand when our data is being shared with a third party, maybe there's pieces of data that we cannot share with them. So only use third-party content when it is required and that we are following the laws that apply to us. And we can even go far as to if the user's browser, they have the do not track setting, well, hopefully we're going to follow that. And we're not going to be collecting any data that they have asked us not to. And as we saw with the story I talked about at the very beginning with TikTok and the Federal Trade Commission, this is being taken more and more seriously by governments. And if we are found to not be following the correct processes and we are sharing sensitive data when we shouldn't be, that could result in a fine. So we want to develop a third-party monitoring strategy to make sure that we understand, okay, yes, we are sharing certain specific pieces of data with this specific third party, and also if a user complains about this, we have some way to monitor this. So it doesn't come as a surprise to us that we know a user has complained, and maybe they're letting us know we're not doing something correctly, or they were not informed we were doing it. Whoops. I somehow triggered my screensaver. There we go. All right. Let's see. All right, number 8 is outdated personal data. So perhaps members of the development team, when a user first created an account, they were alerted that we would be collecting sensitive data. The user said it was okay. We retrieved that data from them. We are now storing it. But the development team didn't create any functionality to allow the user to correct outdated, incorrect, or just completely bogus data. The functionality isn't there. So we have a failure to update or correct the data. This also could be a way of violating data privacy laws. We have to have functionality that allows users to change this information. And if you've ever moved to a different physical address and then gone into all the accounts you've created, whether it's banking, credit card, utility, that can be a very painful and frustrating process when it's not obvious, how do I correct the data they have? It's my data. I should be able to correct it. So we want to make sure that functionality is built in right from the very beginning. So we have to implement a procedure to how do we update the user's personal data. Maybe we have to do this after a certain time period. Maybe the law says, we have to contact the user. Oh, maybe this is done after we've done a change to our data privacy policy. We have to alert the user, and maybe then the user is given the ability to change, specific pieces of personal data. We want to make sure this functionality is built in so we are not having any kind of violations. Number 9, missing or insufficient session expiration. So what we're talking about here is the user logs into our application. We are storing sensitive personal data that they've said is okay, but if the user doesn't log out, maybe they just close the browser or they just close the tab that they were using, but their session is not terminated, we may be unintentionally opening up a window that allows a malicious user or a malicious hacker to gain access to that user session and gain access to that user's sensitive data without the user having any awareness of that is happening. So session expiration is our responsibility as a development team. Developers, we must end the session when we believe that the user is no longer active. It's called an inactivity timeout. And how long that inactivity timeout triggers, it depends upon the sensitivity of the data that we're collecting. So if this was a financial website that developers were building, well, that is very sensitive data. So maybe if the user hasn't done anything in 10 minutes, we say, okay, we think they're gone, we terminate the session. But if this is something like social media, maybe we say, 45 minutes to an hour. The data isn't very sensitive. There are some laws that protect it, but it's not something that we have to log out the user immediately. Maybe an hour is fine according to the legislation and our own feelings about the sensitivity of the data, because maybe we actually want to expire that session before the law says we have to. Maybe, we want to do it even quicker to protect our users. So having automatic session expiration is something that we always have to set when it comes to an inactivity timeout. Now, that's not the only type of timeout there is. It's one that everyone is the most common with, and developers are very familiar with the inactivity timeout. But there's also another timeout called maximum session lifetime. So this states that even when a user is active at some point in time, whether it's 10 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, we believe it no longer makes sense for that session to be active. So we're going to expire that session, and if the user wants to continue working, they're going to have to re-authenticate. They're going to have to log in again because it just seems odd. So maybe someone comes into work, they log into our application, and they're putting in a long day. Maybe 10 hours makes sense. They would work 10 hours and be active. Their session would be active that entire time. But maybe longer than that, that just doesn't happen. Maybe 12 hours, it doesn't make sense. But if that session is active for 12 hours, 20 hours, 30 hours, now I'm starting to think, I think a malicious hacker has compromised that session and they're trying to steal our data. So we want to make sure with that maximum session lifetime that we just have a sensible time limit on these sessions. So even if a user that works a long day, that's fine, but after, let's say, 10 hours, even if they're active, we're going to make them log in again. We're going to expire that session. We're going to make them log in again. So just to help and just to make sure we're lowering the chances of having any kind of data privacy violation. So the final one here, session timeout should be configurable by the user or according to his or her needs. I will tell you this. One of my coworkers wrote that slide, and then I added, I have never seen this. That is actually giving the responsibility for security into the hands of the user. And I would say for something like a session timeout, personally, I would say don't allow the users to change that because what they'll do is they may make it convenient for themselves without recognizing that there are laws around this type of session timeout that, we have to protect this data. We're protecting them, and so we're not going to give them the ability to change this even if they want to. Now if they want to then, send a communication to our help desk and complain about, well, my session time's out after 10 minutes after I don't do anything and that's too short of a time, well, then we can have a conversation, with our development team and maybe our security team and our privacy team members and say, okay, what does the law say we have to do? Maybe we can extend another 5 minutes, another 10 minutes. But I still wouldn't put that in the hands of our users. I would be doing it in our back end so we make sure we're following the law and we don't give the user the ability to change that, and then it becomes our problem when there's a violation. And finally, the last one, insecure data transfers. So we've collected very sensitive data, but when we transfer it, let's say we're storing all this information into a cloud environment, and we send it up to the cloud environment, and then we encrypt it once it's up there. But when we did that transfer, all that data was sent in plain text. We were using HTTP or we were using FTP. We didn't think about protecting it as it went across the network. So we want to make sure if the law says we have to protect this data, then we encrypt that data before we send it anywhere so it is protected as it goes across the internet. And not only that, we want to make sure development teams have the training to understand that they can't just choose any random encryption algorithm. We want to make sure they are using encryption algorithms that are known as strong, and they haven't chosen one that is weakened or broken. And unfortunately, in many of today's development environments that are being used, now the development environments have cryptography libraries, so developers don't have to write their own encryption code. However, some of the algorithms in those libraries has been weakened or broken since that library was created. So whenever I'm instructing development teams about secure coding, I always make sure they know never write your own encryption algorithm, and if you have to encrypt the data, talk to a member of your security staff and ask them, what encryption algorithm should I be using? we don't expect developers to be experts in cryptography. That is just a very deep topic, and that is, I think it's too much to be expected of a development team. That is something the security team has to be experts in. So want to make sure to lower the risk of having any kind of insecure data transfer issues, that developers know that they never write their own encryption algorithm, and they always ask a member of the security team, what algorithm should we be using, so we make sure we get it right. Because when it comes to protecting the data as it's going across the internet, we're encrypting that data, it is either perfect or it is vulnerable. And we want to make sure we're doing as good a job as we can to get our encryption correct the very first time. And also, the very last point here on this slide, it says disable vulnerable file transfer services such as Telnet and FTP. So there is an actual secure way to use something like FTP. It is called Secure FTP, SFTP, which encrypts the data before it sends it across a network. So we can still have that data transfer just how we like it, but we're doing it in a secure fashion. So want to make sure, and this is just a good best practice for every development team, is make sure they understand that we have to protect that data, whether it's being stored in a database, stored in a file, or it is being sent across a network. And that includes internal to the organization also. If that data has to be protected using encryption as it goes across the public internet, that data should be protected using encryption as it goes across the network within the organization. So we want to make sure that we just don't make any bad assumptions, because there are tools called network sniffers that are free for anyone to download, and that means anyone within the organization who has bad intentions could grab a tool like that, download it to their machine, and possibly see any sensitive data going across our organization's network if we're not protecting it using encryption. And that could then turn into a privacy violation. So we want to make sure development teams are very aware of encrypt that data even when it goes across the internal network. We're just lowering the risk of having any kind of privacy violation issues. So I know that is a lot of information about best practices we can give to our development team and to lowering the risk of having any data privacy violations. But I just want to kind of finish up with here. It's important to recognize that over the years, our development teams do not come out of their universities as data privacy experts. They do not come out, they rarely come out as application security experts. This is something that we need to train them in. I remember that when I was getting my computer science degree, the first two functions I was taught how to use by my first computer science professor had security vulnerabilities. No one told us this. So we want to make sure as an organization that we are doing the right thing and protecting this data. So we have to train our developers so they have an awareness of why we need to protect this data and how they can protect this data. So, and you're absolutely are welcome to use these slides if you need to use them for educational purposes, because that's one of the benefits of joining our webinar today is you get to download these slides. So we just want to make sure that as an organization, we're doing the best job we can, protecting our users' privacy and protecting the organization from our development team making any bad guesses about the correct way to protect our users' data. So now I want to jump into any questions that I have received here. So I have a question here. So, this is a good question. What is your opinion on bug bounties for helping to find privacy violations? So, bug bounties, this is something often used when we're thinking about security vulnerabilities, but it absolutely could be thought of in terms of data privacy violations also too. And while I think bug bounties are great for organizations that have very mature application security and data privacy best practices for their development teams. I don't recommend organizations that are not mature starting a bug bounty program or contracting with another organization that does bug bounty programs, because it can get very overwhelming if you're not ready for it. You would be jumping in to the deep end of the pool. Basically, you might all of a sudden be getting just an enormous amount of information about privacy violations and security vulnerabilities, and you're just not ready for it yet. Your development team hasn't been trained in how to fix those and write their code securely. Maybe you don't have the change management process already in place. So bug bounties are really something for only organizations that have mature data privacy best practices and application security best practices. Next question here. I want to make sure I'm not overwhelming the dev team with data privacy best practices. What do you suggest I do? Absolutely, that is definitely, as a former developer, please don't overwhelm the development team. I totally agree with that. We really want to make sure when we do add changes to our development team's process and best practices, slow, small steps. And now that may not sound like, well, we need to do this, we need to get this implemented as quickly as we can. I totally understand that. But if we want to get it done correctly, we want to lower the risk of the development team being overwhelmed, because if that happens, they will start to ignore us. So the smaller changes will build up over time. And before we know it, a year, 18 months down the road, we've implemented a lot of changes and best practice into our development process, and now we're feeling really good about how we handle data privacy and how we handle application security. So that is the best way I can recommend that. Next question here. When it comes to privacy protection, California privacy protection, how much of a real burden does GDPR place on U.S. businesses? Yes, absolutely. Even though GDPR is only for citizens of the European Union, if a United States business has customers that are members of the European Union, GDPR does apply to us. And I can tell you, big name organizations like Google and Facebook have already come under punishment from GDPR because they were not following their data privacy laws. So there is definitely a real burden there. So if you know your organization has customers that are in the European Union, this is something that you definitely have to be very, very concerned about. Same thing with California privacy protection. Maybe your organization is in Massachusetts, but some of your customers are located in California. You have to make sure that those customers in California, their data is protected following California privacy laws. And so often what we see happen is that organizations will just say, well, then all of our customers we're just going to treat all of our customers as if they fall under California privacy protection, or all of our customers fall under GDPR. But there is a burden there. There definitely is. So, and if there isn't yet, if you don't have customers that fall under those laws, at some point, every state is going to have data privacy legislation that will affect you. So we just say, hey, get ahead of the curve and start working on it now. Last question before I have to finish. Could you tell a strategy to define what's sensitive information from users and what's not? For example, our team discovered that IPs may be considered sensitive information since you can correlate that with geography. Yes, here's the strategy. You need to get a business analyst involved, a subject matter expert, and that's why I say a business analyst, because they understand the data. And if you have a legal team, get a member of the legal team, or if not, hire an attorney that is familiar with the data privacy laws, because you're going to need their expertise to help you understand the law when it comes to understanding what data falls under as being protected by those laws. Developers will not understand it. We're not experts in that. So you really need legal help, and you need subject matter expertise when it comes to that data. So you need one of your business analysts who understands that data. As a developer, I can write you great software. It does not mean I'm an expert on the data that I am processing. I may just not have a good understanding of it. I can still write great software though. Okay, I'm gonna answer this one last question. Yes, you will receive a copy of the slide deck at the end. Happy to do that. You'll receive an email afterwards. And let's see here. GDPR created a policy and process nightmare for responsible entities worldwide. What's to stop another country to do the same, and then another country and another country? And I'm afraid the answer is there's nothing stopping them. So we recommend, as soon as you can, start building a data privacy, best practices, policies into your organization now. So just assume it's going to happen at some point if it hasn't already. That is the best answer I can give to you, because it probably is going to happen, actually. And it's not a matter of if, it is a matter of when. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate you all showing up today. And like I said, you'll receive an email probably within the next 24 hours with a link to the slides so you can all have access to them. And you also have an access to the recording of this webinar if you want to share it with your colleagues. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.